Hi, Kinesiology 3010. Today we're going to talk about developing written tests and surveys, and what the differences are and what are some benefits for those. So a written test is used to measure cognitive objectives. So most of the measurements we've been doing throughout this class are physiological measurements or anthropometric measurements, or sport performance, exercise performance measurements. With a written test, we're looking at cognitive achievement. So we're looking at knowledge and the ability to express knowledge within these tests. A questionnaire is slightly different. This is where we have separate objectives that are based on thought, attitude, opinion, and we often use these questionnaires in research to learn about how individuals feel, different preferences. We talked a little bit about these questionnaires in the psychological evaluation section for this class. So we use questionnaires in different types to understand more of the emotional or the attitude, or understand different thoughts from a participant in research or an individual. Maybe it's within your school, within your company, and you're trying to understand how they feel and what they think. When we go into these different knowledge-based tests, we have a mastery test and a discrimination or achievement-based test. So these are slightly different, and we use them for different requirements when we have different pieces that we need to know about someone's knowledge. Okay, so for a mastery test, this is used as kind of a minimum requirement test, or to show that you have enough knowledge to fit a criteria. So an example here would be like your driver's license test. You have to meet a minimum standard or a minimum criteria in order to achieve that status of being a licensed driver. If we think about this in the context of exercise science, kinesiology, we can look at our exam. So say your Kinesiology 3010 final exam, you have to reach a certain level of achievement within the final exam in order to show knowledge, or within the entire class to reach the standard of passing the class. If we look within kind of the general field, if you're looking for certifications, things like, for example, the Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist certification, you have to achieve a minimum standard, or minimum correct number of answers on the test in order to receive that certification. Otherwise, you do not meet the criteria. You do not show that you have mastery of that content, and you don't earn that that licensure, that certification. So you will have to encounter these different types of mastery tests further on in your career. And you may want to use them as ways to assess if maybe it's an intern, maybe it's someone within your program, if they have enough knowledge in order to continue with whatever they're trying to do for that profession. Achievement tests are a little bit different. These are used to differentiate knowledge levels. So this is kind of stratifying a group based on their performance within this test. So these are norm reference tests. So an achievement test is a norm reference test compared to a mastery test, which is a criterion-based test, or a criterion reference test. So an example here would be the graduate record exam, or the GRE. This is an exam that you'll have to take if you plan to go to a graduate school. You'll likely have to take a GRE, which has a writing, a verbal reasoning, and a mathematics portion. And you have to achieve a certain level based on the school's criteria in order to enter into a graduate program. So this stratifies, or is a norm reference test, so it stratifies those who are above average or above the 50th percentile, those who are below, and gives you a score based on how you stack up to others that have taken that test. So this is how we level up an achievement test, to understand, hey, are you on the upper levels of this group that's applying, or are you on the lower levels, and which is sufficient for you to enter maybe this program, or to enter this different level of kind of knowledge based on what you perform compared to others. And so how do we create these tests? How do we decide which items or which questions we use within these tests? So we call each question an item when we're looking at how we design this test. And how many items you need depends on things like time available for testing. So if you're taking a class that's a 50-minute class, you only have enough time within that section to answer a certain number of questions. A good kind of rule of thumb is with the minutes available in the class for the exam, you don't want to overshoot that within the questions. So if you have a 50-minute exam, you don't want to go over 50 questions. That's kind of if you're going above that, then there's probably not going to be enough time available for testing, which may hinder the student's performance or the testee's performance. So you want to make sure that there's enough time available for them to answer the questions. Then we have to look at which types of questions we'll use. We'll talk about this a little bit later about which types of questions you can use. Then you also have to think about the attention span of the students. If you're working with 7-year-olds compared to 14-year-olds, compared to 18-year-olds, compared to 20-year-olds, the attention span is very different between age groups, between content. If they're very interested in the content, maybe it's a major specific content compared to maybe some general education course that that student doesn't find very appealing. Understanding how long someone can sit still and pay attention can play a role. So understanding that it's very difficult to sit there for 3 hours straight and take an exam and still focus. So plan that in about how long you think they will pay attention to certain content. Maybe you have to change the types of questions throughout the test, change the types of questions as a way to alter attention so that maybe you're focusing a little bit more in one area. Maybe you use multiple choice questions. And then once you feel that they would probably be losing attention, maybe now you use an essay style format question. So now their attention is switched. They're resetting into a different lens. And then once you feel like that's probably enough time for that attention, you can change to a different type of question as a way to expand the test if you know you are taking a longer test. So for example, your final exam, there will be different types of questions throughout the exam, and it should not be longer than the time available for the testing. So what different types of questions do you have? We have semi-objective questions, we have objective questions, and then essay questions. These are the major types of questions that you'll likely encounter when creating a mastery-based test. Some semi-objective question examples are things like short answer, fill in the blank, completion questions, mathematical questions, where there is a right answer, but there is some room for interpretation. So these are not clear-cut yes, no. Sometimes they're a little bit more open-ended. So maybe you can gain points throughout. So most semi-objective questions, maybe there's a short answer. It's worth something like 4 points. Maybe you correctly answer a couple points and you incorrectly answer a couple other points. Maybe you scored 2 out of 4 for that short answer question, rather than in objective questions where we see it's very yes or no. There is correct answer and there is incorrect answers. So going back to those semi-objective questions, things like a completion question, like filling in the blank, especially short answer style where there's more options, and you have to bring the options out. You're not pulling from some kind of word bank thing like that. And then also mathematical questions, because you do have mathematical processes. If you do some of the processes correct, you may earn some points. So that's kind of the difference with these semi-objective questions compared to objective questions. With objective questions, there is a correct answer. There is an absolute yes correct answer, and then there's an absolute no incorrect answer. So for example, on your quiz recently, you had an example of questions that were very objective questions. They're very multiple choice, true, false, and then you had some open-ended questions that were short answer based. and you may earn all points or some points based on the correctness of your answer. So I do recommend, if you're doing any kind of subjective or semi-objective questions like short answer, set out the rubric ahead of time and say, okay, this is what is required, and then grade based on that. So do they answer this? Do they say this? Do they answer this? And use it as ways to check off if that happened, and then you have that leeway for interpretation because you know what you want as what you think is the most correct answer, and then you can stratify out of that of, okay, this is somewhat correct, kind of correct, completely incorrect, and scale it that way. With objective questions, these are very cut and dry, yes, no, true, false, pick one of the 4, pick one of the 5. There's no real room for interpretation here, but it also doesn't show the same amount of somewhat knowledge mastery. So using more semi-objective questions shows what your students or what the testee can tell you about a topic or what they know about a topic, compared to objective questions. They're picking what they see as correct from a group. So the recall is different, and then the understanding of mastery is slightly different. So you do have to think of that when you're creating the tests. Things that are more objective questions, I like to use those more in quiz settings and as parts of exams or parts of mastery tests, and more of the bulk of mastery tests in introductory courses, where understanding the terms and understanding the knowledge is key. But when you move into more advanced courses or more advanced knowledge where you have a background, I like to lean more on semi-objective questions and moving into more essay-based questions, because that does show more of a ability to express your knowledge, either using oral exams where you're talking and discussing, and in written exams. When it comes to these objective questions, true false questions talk about the main idea of a question. So we're looking at what is correct, and then are you able to read a scenario or read a situation and understand, is this also correct or is this incorrect? But this does have a 50-50 shot, and I do recommend using approximately the same number of true and false statements throughout an entire mastery test. So if you have 10 questions and all of them are true, or all of them are false, that really doesn't show a wide variety and challenge the students to the same way. So I do recommend somewhat approximately the same number. It doesn't have to be like 5 and 5. Be like 7 to 3 would probably be the farthest spread I'd go on a 10 question true false section of an exam. With multiple choice questions, we want to make sure that we keep the responses short, and the stems or the base question very clear. And we want to state the stems in more positive ways. So we want to have a clear, concise, understandable stem, and then we can have different short and very discrete responses that we know are going to either align or not align with that stem. And the more complex the multiple choice questions, so the more the stem is more elaborate and the responses are more elaborate, the longer it will take a student or a testee to take that exam or to deal with that question. So you do have to factor that in. If you're using long form multiple choice questions, it's going to take more time than very short, concise questions. So factor that into your total time of exam. Then we come to essay questions. I referenced these slightly a little bit earlier, but these are ways to understand student knowledge in a broader way, or testee knowledge more broadly rather than very concise one point. So you would state a question clearly, concisely, and then ask that question is very open-ended. So maybe they're prompted to explain how you can do this, explain this. diagram this and define and describe why this is. So those are very broad, open-ended questions. You're asking a clear question, but you have a broad number of answers that can come there. And then when you're preparing that question, you want to prepare the ideal answer and work back from there. So you're starting at what would be 100% of the credit for this question. And then out of that perfect answer, what is worth more, what is worth less, kind of creating a rubric within this essay question in order to accurately and objectively grade that answer among all of the testees, because they're all going to answer it very differently. You want to have some kind of structure rubric for that essay question so that everyone is measured on the same scale. Okay, and then when we're constructing this test, we talk about what kinds of questions, but we want to kind of create a table of what we want. So this is the best way to visualize this scenario. So we'll create a table. We'll decide which types of questions we want to use. So do I want to use multiple choice? Do I want to involve some true and false? Do I want to involve an essay? Do I want to use semi-objective questions? Is there mathematics involved? Construct test questions themselves to describe each of those components. And determine the test format and administrative details. So is this going to be online? Is this going to be in person? How long do they have to take this test? Where will they be taking this test? What materials can they use? Can they use a calculator? Is there going to be a formula sheet? Things like that. Is it open book or not open book? So here's an example of a table of specifications. So we have things, this is an example of something in kinesiology 3010 like you're in right now. So think concepts of measurements and testing, things like that we went over at the initial part of the chapter or of the class. Things like reliability and validity, maybe because those have a little bit higher weight when it comes to creating studies. We had a little bit more questions. Adult and youth fitness, skills, and qualitative analysis, because we've gone through a little bit more with your project here. Maybe there'll be a few more questions there. Descriptive and inferential statistics. We spent a long time on those sections, so we may add some more number of questions there, add in some mathematic portions, change the test types, and then what we're going over right now, grading and assessments and tests, could be a few less questions because we're not spending a whole lot of time on this. So look at it as how much time do you spend, and then how would you allot those point totals? So for example, if this test is 46 questions, 7.5% of that would give you 4 total questions. So for example here, 7.5% of the exam is 4 total questions in this sense. So looking at your concepts, you can break this down even further to which types of questions you would use. So conceptual questions, likely something like multiple choice, true, false, validity and reliability, maybe some fill in the blank, maybe some true and false and multiple choice. Adult and youth fitness, maybe some situations and we'll have some short answers, something like that. Skills test and qualitative analysis, maybe some more semi-objective questions there. Maybe incorporate some mathematics-based questions in the statistics section because we did spend a lot of time going through how to calculate and what these mean. And then likely more true, false, or maybe an essay style question for the performance tests or different types of grading or psychological measurements. That's just an example. That is not exactly what's on your exam, but that's just how we would structure these tests. Now let's move on to questionnaires and surveys. So we use these often for research purposes to learn something about someone's thoughts, ideas. So whenever we're doing this, we define the objectives. So what do we want to learn? What do we want to know? You're likely doing your SOCIs or your student opinion on curriculum and instruction surveys. Those are surveys that are used for research for the purposes of faculty and the administrators seeing if your faculty is doing a great job, if your instructor is doing well at helping you through this information, discussing the information, helping you learn what do they do well and what don't they do well. So that's a research about how that person is doing within their job. So I do recommend, if you haven't done that SOSI, please do those SOSIs. I do read them all. My boss reads them all. My boss's boss reads them all. And I really want to improve this course, and I want to know what I'm doing well and what I'm not doing well. So please fill out those surveys. All right. And then we also have to identify who we're giving that survey to. So we talked a little bit about using surveys with youth populations and how that's difficult because that sample is not very, they probably have a shorter attention span. They maybe don't understand some of the questions. So we have to identify the sample we're going to use and construct the questionnaire with that sample in mind. Make sure that the wording makes sense and that it's understandable for that sample. And then you want to run a pilot for the survey. Make sure that those questions are being answered in the way that you thought they would be answered, or understanding if you're able to actually administer that survey. Will people take that survey? Sometimes if your survey is a little too long, a little too wordy, it may lose attention and people just won't do it. If they see that there is a 200 question or 200 item survey, probably not going to spend another hour plus taking that survey. So keeping the surveys a little bit more short and concise, using a cover letter that describes what's the purpose here. Send the questionnaire to the people that you want to, or that sample who you're trying to learn about, and then follow up and analyze that data. So we want to measure that data. We're measuring kind of thought and idea and emotion-based data. And then we want to report our results, because if we're doing research, we want to analyze, and then we want to report so that everyone knows what's going on with that research. What's the new knowledge that we have, that we've found. So there's different types of questions. I'm just going to give you some examples here. Things like pre-coded questions or single choice questions. Think of these similar to multiple choice questions on a mastery test, where you are checking one of the boxes. Only one can be true, and you're picking that one that applies to you. Okay, so something like, what year are you in school? Or you can use closed-ended questions, which give you kind of a range. These are less accurate, but they also are able to bring in a broader amount of information with less questions. So this gives you kind of a range of, in this case, the population of your hometown. Was it a rural area? Under 5,000, so rural area, very extremely small in the hundreds, low thousands. Town under 5,000, between 5,000 and just under 20,000, 20,000 to 100,000, 100,000 to a million, or a million and over. So this gives you a range. It's very closed-ended, so you can't ask them exactly how many people were in their hometown, but it does give you some similar information, and it's easier for someone to answer this question than to give a very exact answer. You can also use open-ended questions where you ask, kind of fill in the blank, what year were you born? Or what is one thing that you've seen change at the university? So these are open-ended. These are harder to grade and rank, and they're more difficult to analyze. So those closed-ended questions that we saw before are easy to analyze. They're a little bit more objective, but our open-ended questions are a little bit more difficult, a little bit more challenging, and we have to take that into account. You can also use ones like ranking. So what is most important to you from 1 to 10 or 1 to 7? Which of these is most important? So you don't have to, or these are a little bit easier to score, and they're a little bit easier to analyze compared to those open-ended questions, but it still doesn't give you a lot of further information. So the more detail comes in open-ended questions, less detail, but maybe a little bit easier to analyze questions are more closed or ranking questions. We can also use ones like Likert scale questions. So these are from a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree, and you're looking at a sliding scale of maybe 1 to 5 or 1 to 9, and looking at how someone feels along that scale. These are used often in psychological measurements, and gives you a nice way to objectively measure how someone feels about a question. So make sure that these questions are clear, so that we can tell if they agree with the statement or don't agree with the statement, and make sure they're very specific to what you're trying to ask. So there are some advantages to these open-ended questions where you're allowing that the person taking the survey to respond with detail and be creative and answer the question specifically to them. But it is more difficult to analyze, and it takes more time for that person to complete that questionnaire. So if you have a long questionnaire with lots of open-ended questions, you may be getting a lot of detailed answers, but at the same time, it's going to be very difficult to analyze and require more time for that person to complete it. So you may not have the same amount of people who would actually complete that survey based on just the time requirements. So the chance of retaining that survey taker for the entire survey is very low. So there are some advantages to closed-ended questions also. They are easy to respond and they're easy to code and analyze. So if we have a long questionnaire, it's easier to use more closed-ended questions because they're easier to analyze, they're easier to code, and easier to use more objective statistics to analyze those responses. But some of the disadvantages are that it's difficult to create questions that are going to give you enough detail for you to find differences or find relationships between how someone feels and what's going on, or maybe a performance measurement, something like that. And it doesn't allow for detail and higher level thinking. It's really just checking a box on what applies. So we have to think about weighing in our options of, is it better for us to have an easier questionnaire, or do we need more detail? How many questions can we ask? How long does it take to fill out this questionnaire? What's my sample? So there's a lot of different aspects that we need to think about, and then really apply it and take the time to really create a high quality survey. Okay. But there are some general issues like reliability. So how consistently a measurement is, because there are changes in mood, changes in attention, changes in how someone feels. The reliability and consistency of those surveys can be in jeopardy. The validity of those surveys, someone can answer a question based on how they think you want them to answer rather than what is actually true. So biases and misanswering questions based on kind of perceptions of how they should be answering questions are something that we need to think about within this reliability and validity. And then how can we generalize this? We have to make sure that our sample is not too broad, but it is a group that is who we can generalize about. So creating or deciding on a quality sample, and we need a large sample when we're using these questionnaires because of the lack of reliability and validity. We have to use larger samples in order to have the same generalizability that we would have from a very small sample, but very discrete, maybe more physiological measurements. All right, for the end here, I do have a little activity that you can go through to help you practice kind of these concepts. I have a situation here. You just met a new client who is 35 years old and is looking to improve their body composition and overall health. They came to you at your personal training clinic that you're working. I want you to create a 5-item questionnaire to get to know this client's physical activity, exercise, and nutrition habits. So those are your 3 categories: physical activity, exercise, and nutrition habits. And then you must include 1 to 2 of the following questions: open-ended questions, rank order, and Likert style questions for this survey. So you're creating your own little 5-question survey that you're going to give to your new client to understand where they sit on their physical activity, their exercise and nutrition habits, so that you can best give them a quality training program and training sessions in order to improve their body composition and overall health, just like they're trying to achieve here in this situation. All right, wink, wink. This might be something similar to what's on your exam. And have a great day.